Determining when the Wild West era ended is like asking, at what point does a plant become a tree? There isn't a specific moment when a seedling turns into a tree. Rather, certain notable markers signify its growth. Defining the beginning and ending of the Wild West is subject to debate. Some argue it started as early as the settlement at Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. Others argue that it just migrated west as European settlement grew. When the Wild West ended is also tricky. Was it when quick-draw duels stopped? Was it when the last Native Americans were subjugated? Or was it when there was no longer a frontier? However, in some ways, you could say the Old West never ended. It lives on today, in imagination everywhere. Paintings of grazing bison and western sunsets hang in homes across the USA. The Western as a genre is still as popular as ever in books, movies, and games. In today's video, we will reveal how the curtain fell on one of the most notable periods in history. Stay tuned as we learn how the end of the old Wild West came about. Historians say the Wild West ended around 19, but that is contestable, as the Wild West was a period of American history that lasted from roughly 1865 to 24. The period, which took place on the frontier of the American West, was marked by lawlessness in America's unincorporated territory. Cattle drives, westward expansion and settlement, the proliferation of immoral businesses such as bordellos and saloons, the rise of outlaw gangs, and conflicts with Native Americans earmarked the era. The Wild West has been immortalized by the cowboy image, which represented rugged individualism and survival, and came to become a cultural icon of America. Sadly, this era was brought to an end by intense crackdowns on outlawry by lawmen and bounty hunters. The incorporation of the Western territories into the Union, technological modernizations such as railroads and air conditioning that encouraged further settlement of the West, the growth of Western cities, and the concurrent decline of the rural West. Completing the railroads to the West, following the Civil War, opened up vast areas of the region to settlement and economic development. White settlers from the East poured across the Mississippi to mine, farm, and ranch. African-American settlers also came west from the Deep South, convinced by promoters of all black Western towns that prosperity could be found there. Chinese railroad workers further added to the diversity of the region's population. Settlement from the east transformed the Great Plains. The huge herds of American bison that roamed the plains were almost wiped out, and farmers plowed the natural grasses to plant wheat and other crops. The cattle industry rose in importance as the railroad provided a practical means for getting the cattle to market. The loss of the bison and the growth of white settlement drastically affected the lives of the Native Americans living in the West. In the conflicts that resulted, the American Indians, despite occasional victories, seemed doomed to defeat by the greater numbers of settlers and the military force of the U.S. government. By the 1880s, most American Indians had been confined to reservations, often in areas of the West that appeared least desirable to white settlers. The cowboy became the symbol for the West in the late 19th century, often depicted in popular culture as a glamorous or heroic figure. The stereotype of the heroic white cowboy is far from true, however. The first cowboys were Spanish vaqueros, who had introduced cattle to Mexico centuries earlier. Black cowboys also rode the range. Furthermore, the cowboy's life was far from glamorous, involving long, hard hours of labor, poor living conditions, and economic hardship. The myth of the cowboy is one of the many myths that have shaped our views of the West in the late 19th century. Recently, Some historians have turned away from the traditional view of the West as a frontier, a meeting point between civilization and savagery, in the words of historian Frederick Jackson Turner. They have begun writing about the West as a crossroads of cultures where various groups struggled for property, profit, and cultural dominance. The cowboys have been largely grayed out of the collective memory of the event, reduced to anonymous villains compared to Town Marshal Virgil Earp and his deputies. The year 1881 was one of the wildest 12 months in the American Old West, at least as big-name shootouts go. 3 months before the OK Corral, on 14 July, Sheriff Pat Garrett gunned down Billy the Kid, while earlier in April, the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight had taken place in the infamously lawless town of El Paso, Texas. This marked a turning point in the Wild West and set the era rolling towards its end. For large periods of the preceding 200-plus years, ever since pioneers began exploring inland from the English settlement at Jamestown in Virginia, the rolling western frontier was more dangerous than it was towards the end of the 19th century, when many westerns were set. Many factors contributed to this. The huge swathes of unforgiving natural terrain and the resistance put up by aggrieved indigenous occupants of the land made any attempts at travel a serious risk. Then there was the fact that the newcomers would be transient, overwhelmingly single males, tooled up with increasingly affordable firearms bought with gold rush cash. Typically, they were fiercely protective over what was theirs, brutalized by conflicts such as the American Civil War, and concentrated in lawless boomtowns. The American Civil War between 1861 and 1865 had a major impact on the West. While predominantly fought in the East, it left young communities splintered and spat out a generation of experienced killers, heavily armed and desensitized to violence. Once the war was over, some men, including Jesse James and his brother Frank, put their skills to work robbing banks. Official law and order were almost absent for much of the era, as authorities struggled to keep up with the restless and ever-expanding landscape. Things only got worse when a carpenter named James W. Marshall struck gold at Sutter's Mill on the 24th of January, 1848. In the California gold rush that followed, hundreds of thousands of mostly men from all over the world arrived hoping to get rich. This created a social situation where the only recreational outlets were brothels, saloons, and gaming houses. Mexican laws no longer applied in the embryonic state, and American rules were loose, with few lawmen to enforce them. For the rise in lawlessness, however, the late 1860s also saw an explosion of investment. In the just 4 years after Civil War hostilities had ended, the golden spike was hammered home at Promontory Summit, Utah, which symbolically connected to sea, Valley Bell, rail tracks, Central Pacific and Union Pacific, to create the first transcontinental railroad. Several bridges had to be built before this Atlantic-Pacific line was truly operational. But by the end of the 1870s, travel across the breadth of the expanding United States had become relatively easy. The journey took days on a train, compared to weeks or even months by wagon, and that came with the threat of attack at any moment. Migration increased enormously, with many women and young families among the new arrivals. Goods and resources could be transported coast to coast like never before, which fueled the economy of the West. Yet during the laying of the track, the rail companies decimated wild bison numbers on the plains, employing men like William Frederick Buffalo Bill Cody to hunt them by the thousand. Ostensibly, this was to provide meat for the rail workers or remove the threat the large animals posed to trains, but the practice removed a chief source of food and clothing for the Native American populations. Simultaneously, the government forced tribes onto reservations. The railroad heralded major changes, so much so that some historians have argued its completion marks the beginning of the end of the true Wild West. But there were still opportunities for outlaws. Huge expanses of land meant they could easily disappear by heading through remote passes or into the Badlands to hide out. Famously, the hole-in-the-wall pass in the Bighorn Mountains of Johnson County, Wyoming, was used by gangs throughout the era, including by Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, and was never penetrated by lawmen. Most outlaws, though, had petty and opportunistic crimes driven by drink, gold fever, and an absence of controlling factors such as family and effective authority. Another factor that contributed to the end of the Wild West was the coming of posses and pinks. The state of law enforcement in California, where the population and crime rate had risen rapidly after the gold rush, led to the creation of the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance in 1851. The 700-strong citizen mob dealt with alleged indiscretions immediately, passing judgment on suspected criminals without trial and dishing out justice, including death by hanging and shooting. Similar committees sprouted up in Texas and elsewhere, and many were active for decades. Private agencies also assumed the role of law enforcers and property protectors. The best known was the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, established by Scotsman Allan Pinkerton, a pioneering detective and spy. He had been appointed Chicago's first detective in 1849 and launched the Northwestern Police Agency, which became the Pinkertons. In the mid-1850s, Allan Pinkerton was engaged by the Illinois Central Railroad to protect their trains. After solving several robberies, he met the company's lawyer, Abraham Lincoln, once elected president, and with the American Civil War clouds gathering, Lincoln chose Pinkerton to head his security and run the Union Intelligence Service, a precursor to the U.S. Secret Service. It proved to be a wise move, as Pinkerton successfully saved Lincoln's life by foiling a planned assassination attempt as the president traveled to his inauguration. After the war, Pinkerton established a private law enforcement agency in the West, where gangs were running amok, robbing banks and trains. His agents, known derisively as Pinks by their prey, were unrestrained by state borders in their relentless hounding of outlaws, from the Reno Gang to the Wild Bunch. They chased Butch and Sundance right down into South America, but Pinkerton famously failed to catch Jesse James. Despite vigilante groups and the pursuit of the Pinkertons, some settlements were notorious as outlaw towns. Yet, as time passed, even the wildest started introducing some rules. Tombstone, Dodge City, and Deadwood were some places that banned civilians from carrying concealed weapons within town limits. There were later prohibitions on the open carrying of guns, too, so cowboys couldn't necessarily swagger the streets and drink in saloons with six-shooters hanging at their hips. That didn't stop gunfights from taking place, of course. The first recorded quick-draw duel was between Wild Bill Hickok and Davis Tutt in 1865. Fought in the town square of Springfield, Missouri. There was bad blood between the former friends over a woman, which worsened until a duel was called over a gambling debt. Unlike portrayals of such fights in westerns, the men stood sideways to present a smaller target about 70 meters apart before drawing their guns and shooting. Tutt missed, and Wild Bill's bullet pierced his opponent's heart. Hickok was arrested 2 days after the duel and tried for murder, but the judge advised the jury that, while he was undoubtedly guilty of manslaughter, they could apply the unwritten law of the fair fight. He was acquitted and later worked in Kansas as Marshal of Hays, Sheriff of Ellis County, and then City Marshal of Abilene. Hickok would be involved in many more fatal gunfights, while a lawman, until he was eventually relieved of his duties after accidentally shooting dead one of his deputies. The West's fluid frontier also set the Wild West on course to its end. From the early 17th century, when British colonists first laid down roots on the east coast of the New World, the wide western horizon beckoned and teased with promise. Over the next 3 centuries, hunters, explorers, and prospectors pioneered the way, battling over frozen mountain passes, across arid deserts, and through hostile terrain. Not far behind were settlers and farmers in wagons, and then desperados and bandits often lurked on the trail. The original borders of the sovereign United States were set in 1783. With the Treaty of Paris, at the end of the American War of Independence, Canada bounded the new nation to the north, Florida to the south, and the mighty Mississippi River to the west. But this last line was fluid and constantly being pushed outwards. The territory around and beyond the western frontier was enormous, but far from empty. Native American tribes had long lived on the land, and many fought back ferociously against the encroaching colonists. But European firearms and diseases decimated them. The survivors were gradually hounded onto reserves. The Louisiana Purchase, 18 of March, added another 828,000 square miles of territory, acquired from France, which instantly doubled the size of the country. Texas joined the Union in 1845. Mexico ceded California and huge swathes of other future states to their rapidly expanding northern neighbor in 1848 and 1853. The American Civil War interrupted U.S. expansion, but after the hostilities ended, a railroad was laid across the continent, making coast-to-coast transportation and travel easier, quicker, and safer. In 1890, the U.S. Census declared there was no longer a clear line of advancing settlement. Manifest destiny, the belief that Christian settlers were divinely ordained to control the whole of North America, seemed fulfilled. The era of the Wild West was effectively over, if not in American popular culture. Rogue lawmen also had their fair share of contributions towards the end of the Wild West era. Often, the only discernible difference between an enforcer of the law and a gun-toting outlaw was the star on their chest. It needed grit in the guts to wear that badge, plus a flexible attitude to due process. On the 11th of April, 1881, the noted gunslinger Dallas Stoudemire was sworn in as El Paso's 6th town marshal in 8 months, and 3 days later he was caught up in the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight. With a hail of bullets, he caused 3 of the fatalities. Then, during a botched attempt at revenge, Stoudemire shot the testicles of his would-be assassin and watched as he bled to death. Such a life could only end one way. On the 18th of September, 1882, he was shot by the Manning brothers, another feared gunman. Long-haired Jim Curtright carved out a successful career as a shooting repeat offenders, but he notoriously used his badge and deadly reputation to extort money from business owners, a practice that came to an abrupt end when Luke Short killed him. In 1887, both Short and Curtright were friendly with Wyatt Earp, a rambling gambling character who worked for a while as a lawman in Dodge City before moving to Texas. There, a cowboy dentist named John Doc Holliday saved his life, and the two became close. In 1879, Earp moved to the silver mining boomtown of Tombstone with his brothers James, Morgan, and Virgil, who were city marshals and deputy U.S. marshal. A little under 2 years later, their conflict with the cowboys spilled over into the most famous gunfights at the OK Corral. That was not the end of the feud, though. Surviving members of the Cowboys' gang ambushed Virgil and Morgan, maiming the former and killing the latter. In response, Wyatt, despite now being a deputy U.S. Marshal after taking over from his injured brother, decided to take the law into his own hands. He gathered his brothers Warren and James, and together with Holliday, led a posse in pursuit of the Cowboys across Arizona. His extrajudicial vendetta ride resulted in the deaths of 4 outlaws, and arrest warrants being issued for the rogue lawmen. Perhaps The gunfight at the OK Corral and its violent aftermath have been so celebrated because the saga not only epitomized many elements of the Wild West, but came when the era ended. Soon afterward, policing became more professional in the western states, as encapsulated by the careers of a trio of legendary lawmen known as the Three Guardsmen. Deputy U.S. Marshals Bill Tillman, Chris Madsen, and Heck Thomas. Between 1889 and the turn of the century, they effectively cleaned up the Indian territories and the future state of Oklahoma. They pursued the Dalton and Doolin gangs, which ended in the deaths of Bill Doolin, Dynamite Dan Clifton, Richard Little Dick West, and William Little Bill Radler, and they were credited with arresting more than 300 outlaws within a decade, leaving the West much less wild. The Wild West era of American history is often romanticized in popular culture, with images of tough gunslingers and daring outlaws capturing the public's imagination. However, the era's reality was often brutal and lawless, with outlaws and lawmen operating outside the bounds of traditional law and order. As we come to the end of our exploration of the Wild West's legendary era, it's important to examine the legacy of that era. One of the enduring legacies of the Wild West's outlaws is the myth and legend surrounding them. From Jesse James to Billy the Kid, these figures have been immortalized in popular culture and become symbols of rebellion and defiance. However, it's important to remember that many of these outlaws were violent criminals who caused harm to innocent people. While their stories may be compelling, we must be careful not to glorify their actions or romanticize their lives. In addition, while the outlaws of the Wild West may have captured our imaginations, it's important not to forget the role that lawmen played in bringing these criminals to justice. Figures like Wyatt Earp and Pat Garrett may not be as well known as their outlaw counterparts, but they played a crucial role in maintaining law and order in a time of chaos. Their legacy is one of bravery and dedication to justice, and it's important to remember their contributions to the Wild West. On that note, we end today's episode. Thank you for joining us once again. We hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you will be the first to see our new updates.